At 2:17 a.m., Ethan Carter's phone started ringing. One call, then another, then another. Half asleep, he picked it up, and what he heard made his heart stop. "Your restaurant is on fire." For a few seconds, everything went silent in his mind. Then panic took over. He rushed outside into the pouring rain, started his car, and drove like his life depended on it. But deep inside, he already felt the truth. He was too late. When he arrived, the sky was glowing orange. Flames were eating everything he had built for 12 long years. His restaurant, his dream, his entire life, was burning in front of his eyes. People stood watching. Firefighters tried their best. But Ethan couldn't move. He just stood there, frozen, as the sound of breaking glass and collapsing walls filled the night. And in that moment, something inside him broke forever. Because that restaurant wasn't just a building. It was the place he sacrificed everything for. His sleep, his relationships, his happiness, his entire youth. He gave everything to build it. And now, it was turning into ashes. But what hurt him most wasn't the fire. It was the realization that while he was building success, he was losing his life. As the flames grew stronger, he dropped to his knees in the rain. And for the first time in years, Ethan cried like a broken man. Not because he lost money, not because he lost a building, but because he suddenly realized something terrifying. Without that restaurant, he didn't even know who he was anymore. And that was only the beginning. Because what happened after this night didn't just destroy his life. It forced him to rebuild it from zero, in a way he never expected. Stay with this story, because what comes next will change how you think about loss, success, and life itself. At 2:17 a.m., Ethan Carter woke up to the sound that would destroy his entire life. His phone vibrated violently across the wooden table beside his bed. Half asleep, he reached for it with tired eyes, annoyed at first by whoever was calling so late. But the moment he looked at the screen, his chest tightened. 12 missed calls. 8 unread messages. And they were all from different people. A strange fear crawled into his stomach. Still confused, Ethan opened the first message. "Ethan, wake up." The second one made his hands shake. "Your restaurant is on fire." For a second, his brain refused to understand the words. It felt impossible. Like a nightmare you expect to wake up from in a few seconds. Then another message appeared. "The whole building is burning." Ethan jumped out of bed so fast he nearly fell to the floor. His heart pounded against his chest while he grabbed his jacket and keys. He didn't even change clothes properly. His mind was racing too fast to think clearly. No, this can't be happening. Rain hammered against the windows as he rushed outside. The cold air hit his face hard, but he barely noticed. His hands trembled while starting the car. The engine roared. Then he drove. Faster than he ever had before. Empty streets blurred past him while rain smashed against the windshield. Red traffic lights reflected across wet roads like blood-colored shadows. Ethan kept calling the restaurant manager again and again. No answer. His breathing became heavier. Every second felt longer than the last. That restaurant wasn't just a business to him. It was his entire life. 12 years earlier, Ethan had opened the restaurant with almost nothing. He still remembered painting the walls himself because he couldn't afford workers. He remembered sleeping inside the kitchen during the first few months because he worked 18 hours a day. Most people doubted him back then. "You'll fail in a year. There are too many restaurants already. You're wasting your life." But Ethan refused to quit. He sacrificed everything to make it successful. Birthdays, vacations, relationships, even his health. While others slept, Ethan worked. While others spent time with family, he stayed inside the restaurant handling customers, fixing problems, and chasing perfection. The restaurant became more than a dream. It became his identity. And now, it might already be gone. As Ethan turned the final corner toward downtown, he suddenly saw smoke rising into the dark sky. His heartbeat stopped. No. The closer he drove, the worse it became. Flashing red and blue emergency lights covered the streets. Police cars blocked the road. Fire trucks surrounded the building. And then Ethan saw it. Flames. Massive flames exploding from the windows of his restaurant. The fire lit up the night like a disaster movie. People stood on sidewalks recording videos with their phones while firefighters desperately sprayed water into the building. But the fire was winning. Ethan slammed the brakes and jumped out of the car before it fully stopped. "That's my restaurant," he shouted while running forward. A police officer grabbed him immediately. "Sir, you can't go any closer." Ethan struggled to break free. "Let me go." The building could collapse. But Ethan couldn't listen. Inside those walls were 12 years of his life. Every memory, every sacrifice, every dream. The heat from the flames burned against his skin even from a distance. Smoke filled the air so heavily it became difficult to breathe. Ethan stared in horror as part of the roof suddenly collapsed inward. A loud crash echoed through the street. People gasped around him. One firefighter slowly shook his head. And in that moment, Ethan knew. It was over. His legs became weak. His body felt numb. The restaurant where he spent most of his adult life was disappearing right in front of his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Tears mixed with rain on his face. He remembered his father standing beside him on opening day years ago. "You built this with your heart," his father had said proudly. "Never forget that." His father had died 3 years earlier. After that, Ethan buried himself even deeper into work. The restaurant became the only thing keeping him moving forward. Now even that was being taken away. People nearby whispered quietly while watching the fire. "That's Ethan Carter. He owns this place. I heard he spent years building it." So sad. But Ethan barely heard them. His mind replayed memories like broken pieces of glass. The first customer he ever served. The night the restaurant became successful. The hours he spent alone cleaning tables after midnight. The arguments with people who begged him to slow down. Especially his girlfriend, Lily. "You're never really here anymore," she once told him. "I'm doing this for our future," Ethan replied back then. But deep inside, he knew the truth. The restaurant always came first. Always. Another explosion burst from inside the building, snapping Ethan back to reality. Flames shot through the roof. The crowd stepped backward in fear. Then the fire chief walked toward Ethan slowly, removing his helmet. The expression on his face already said everything. "I'm sorry," the chief said quietly. "The fire spread too fast. There's nothing left to save." Those words shattered something inside Ethan. Nothing left. 12 years. Gone in one night. Ethan dropped to his knees on the wet pavement. For the first time in years, he completely broke down. Not because of the money. Not because of the building. But because he suddenly realized something terrifying. Without the restaurant, he didn't know who he was anymore. The flames continued burning in front of him while rain poured from the dark sky above. And standing there surrounded by smoke, sirens, and ashes, Ethan felt like he had just watched his entire life disappear. The fire was gone by morning. But the destruction it left behind followed Ethan everywhere. A thick smell of smoke still covered the air when he returned to the ruins the next day. Yellow police tape surrounded the building while workers searched through black ashes and broken metal. Everything looked unrecognizable. The windows were shattered. The walls were burned black. The famous sign above the entrance, the sign Ethan once stared at proudly every single night, now hung halfway down, destroyed by flames. Ethan stood silently across the street, unable to move. People passing by slowed down to look at the damage. Some whispered to each other. Others recognized him immediately. "That's the owner. I can't believe this happened. So tragic." Ethan lowered his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt ashamed to be seen. One of the firefighters approached him carrying a small metal object inside a plastic bag. "We found this in the kitchen," he said gently. Ethan opened the bag slowly. Inside was the burned remains of a photo frame. His hands trembled instantly. It was a picture of him and his father on opening day. Both of them smiling proudly in front of the restaurant 12 years earlier. The edges were destroyed by fire, but their faces were still visible. Ethan stared at the photo for several seconds before quietly turning away. That single image hurt more than the entire building collapsing. Because suddenly, all he could think about was how much of his life he had sacrificed for that place. And now, it was gone forever. The days after the fire became a blur of stress, fear, and silence. Insurance investigators called non-stop, asking endless questions. How did the fire start? When was the last safety inspection? Were there any electrical issues? Lawyers contacted him. Banks contacted him. Investors demanded answers. But Ethan barely had the strength to get out of bed. Every morning felt heavier than the last. His apartment became dark and lifeless. Dirty dishes piled near the sink. Empty coffee cups covered the table. Curtains stayed closed all day. Sometimes he sat on the couch for hours staring at nothing. His phone continued ringing constantly. Employees wanted updates. Are we reopening? What should we do now? Will we still have jobs? Those calls destroyed him inside because he had no answers to give them. Most of his employees depended on the restaurant to survive. Some had families. Some had worked with him for years. And now they were all lost because of him. At least that's what Ethan believed. One afternoon, he finally met with his accountant. The numbers were brutal. The insurance payout would take months. Loan payments were already overdue. Repair costs were impossible. You need to prepare yourself, the accountant said carefully. There's a real chance you may lose everything. Everything. That word echoed in Ethan's mind long after the meeting ended. Because the truth was terrifying. The restaurant wasn't only destroyed. He was drowning financially too. The life he spent years building was collapsing piece by piece. And slowly, people started disappearing from his life. Friends who once begged for free tables at his restaurant suddenly stopped calling. Business partners avoided him. People who praised his success vanished the moment things became difficult. Even Lily, the woman who stayed beside him for years, finally reached her limit. One rainy evening, she visited his apartment. Ethan looked exhausted when he opened the door. His beard had grown messy. Dark circles covered his eyes. Lily stepped inside quietly. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then she looked around the apartment and sighed softly. You haven't been taking care of yourself. Ethan forced a weak smile. Doesn't really matter anymore. That's not true. But even her voice sounded tired now. She sat beside him carefully. Ethan, I know you're hurting. But you've been gone long before the fire happened. He looked confused. What do you mean? You gave everything to that restaurant, she said quietly. Every piece of yourself. Ethan stayed silent. You stopped living, she continued. You stopped loving people. You stopped caring about anything except work. That restaurant was our future, Ethan whispered defensively. No, Lily replied with tears in her eyes. It was your whole world. And everyone else came second. Those words hit harder than he expected. Because deep inside, he knew she was right. For years, he convinced himself he was sacrificing everything for success. But maybe success had slowly destroyed him instead. Lily stood up slowly. I still care about you, Ethan. But I don't think you even know who you are without that place. Then she walked toward the door. And this time, she didn't come back. The silence after she left felt unbearable. Ethan sat alone in the dark apartment listening to rain hit the windows. His chest felt empty. Everything was falling apart at once. The restaurant. His money. His relationships. His purpose. Even sleep abandoned him. Every night he replayed the fire inside his mind over and over again. The flames. The collapsing roof. The sound of people whispering around him. Sometimes he blamed himself. Maybe if he worked less, he would have noticed problems earlier. Maybe if he hired better staff. Maybe if he wasn't so obsessed with perfection. His thoughts became darker each day. One afternoon, completely exhausted, Ethan wandered through the city with no destination. Cold wind moved through crowded streets while people rushed past him living normal lives. Businessmen laughed outside coffee shops. Families walked together happily. Cars filled the roads. Meanwhile, Ethan felt invisible, like the world had moved on without him. Hours passed before he finally stopped near a small park. That's when he noticed something unusual. An old man stood beside a tiny coffee cart serving customers with a warm smile. The cart was small and simple. Nothing special. But the old man looked peaceful. Completely peaceful. He laughed with strangers. Remembered customers' names. Moved slowly without stress. Ethan couldn't stop watching him. How could someone with so little seem happier than he ever felt with millions? As Ethan turned to leave, the old man suddenly spoke. "You look like someone carrying pain too heavy for one person." Ethan froze. For a moment, he almost ignored him. But something about the old man's calm voice made him stop. The old man poured a cup of coffee and handed it to him. The next morning, Ethan woke up before sunrise. For a few seconds, he lay still in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling the same emptiness that had followed him for weeks. Then he remembered the old man's words. Sometimes losing everything is the only way we finally discover what truly matters. Ethan slowly sat up. Normally, his mornings began with stress, phone calls, and panic. But today was different. For the first time in years, he had nowhere to rush. No meetings. No customers. No restaurant to save. Strangely, that painful silence also felt peaceful. After taking a quick shower, Ethan walked outside into the cold morning air. The city was still waking up. Shops remained closed, and only a few cars moved through the streets. Without fully thinking about it, his feet carried him back toward the small park. And there it was again. The little coffee cart. Steam rose into the chilly air while the old man calmly prepared drinks for early customers. Some people stopped only for coffee, but many stayed a few extra minutes just to talk to him. Ethan stood nearby quietly. The old man noticed him almost immediately and smiled. "I had a feeling you'd come back." Ethan gave a small nod. "I don't really know why I came." "Sometimes the heart understands things before the mind does," the old man replied softly. Ethan almost smiled for the first time in weeks. The old man introduced himself as Walter. Over the next few days, Ethan kept returning to the park. At first, he simply sat nearby drinking coffee in silence while watching Walter work. But eventually, Walter handed him a box one morning. "Help me carry these cups." Ethan looked confused. "You want me to work here?" Walter laughed gently. "I'm old. I need help. And you need something to do besides drowning in your thoughts." Ethan hesitated. Just months earlier, he owned one of the most successful restaurants in the city. Now he was helping at a tiny coffee cart in the park. Part of his pride hated it. But another part of him, the exhausted, broken part, needed it badly. So he stayed. At first, Ethan only handled small tasks. Cleaning tables. Taking trash out. Serving coffee. But slowly, something unexpected started happening. His mind became quieter. For years, his life moved at a dangerous speed. Every minute was pressure. Every decision felt like survival. But Walter lived differently. He never rushed. Even during busy hours, he smiled calmly. He remembered customers' names, their favorite drinks, and even small details about their lives. "How's your daughter feeling today? Did your job interview go well? Tell your wife I said happy birthday." People didn't only come for coffee. They came because Walter made them feel seen. One afternoon, Ethan finally asked him something that had been bothering him for days. "Why do you seem so happy?" Walter looked surprised. "Happy? Yeah," Ethan said quietly. "You barely own anything. You work outside in the cold. But you smile more than people who have millions." Walter chuckled softly while wiping down the counter. "Because I already learned the lesson you're learning now." Ethan frowned slightly. Walter pointed toward the crowded city streets. "Most people spend their whole lives chasing bigger houses, bigger businesses, more money, more status. They think success will finally make them feel alive." He paused. "But many of them lose themselves before they ever reach happiness." Those words hit Ethan deeply. because that had been his entire life. For years, he believed success required sacrifice. The more pain he endured, the more valuable his life became. But where had that path led him? Loneliness, stress, exhaustion, and eventually, complete destruction. That evening after closing the cart, Ethan and Walter sat together watching the sunset paint the sky orange and gold. The park had become quiet. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan finally asked the question sitting heavy inside his heart. "Why are you helping me?" Walter smiled gently without looking at him. "Because years ago, someone helped me when I lost everything too." Ethan turned toward him slowly. Walter's eyes carried a sadness that suddenly made sense. "I used to own 3 restaurants," Walter admitted quietly. "Big ones. Fancy ones." Ethan looked shocked. "I lost them all after my wife died." Walter's voice remained calm, but the pain underneath it was impossible to miss. "For a long time, I buried myself in work because I didn't know how to face my grief. Eventually, I lost my businesses, my health, and almost myself." Ethan listened silently. "Then one day," Walter continued, "an old friend told me something I never forgot." He looked directly at Ethan. "Your life is more important than what you own." The words settled deep into Ethan's heart. For the first time since the fire, he no longer felt completely alone. Someone else understood his pain. Someone else had survived it. Weeks turned into months. And slowly, Ethan began changing. He started calling his mother again regularly. He apologized to old friends he had ignored for years. He even began exercising in the mornings instead of hiding inside his apartment all day. Little by little, life returned to him. Not the old life filled with pressure and endless work. A different life. A calmer one. One afternoon while serving coffee to a young couple laughing together near the cart, Ethan suddenly realized something shocking. He felt happy. Not fake happiness. Real happiness. The kind he hadn't experienced in years. And in that moment, standing beside a tiny coffee cart in the middle of the park, Ethan understood something that changed him forever. Losing the restaurant didn't end his life. It gave him a second chance to finally live one. 1 year after the fire, Ethan Carter stood quietly across the street staring at a small cafe with nervous eyes. Morning sunlight reflected softly through the front windows while people walked peacefully along the sidewalk outside. Above the entrance hung a simple wooden sign. Second Chance Cafe. Ethan took a slow breath. A year earlier, he had lost everything in flames. Now he was about to begin again. But this time, everything was different. The old Ethan would have built something huge. Expensive furniture. Luxury design. A giant opening event filled with important people and cameras. But after everything he went through, none of those things mattered anymore. This cafe was small. Simple wooden tables filled the room. Warm yellow lights hung from the ceiling. Plants sat near the windows. Family photos and handwritten notes from customers decorated the walls. It didn't look perfect. It looked real. And for the first time in his life, Ethan was proud of something that wasn't built to impress people. Walter stood beside him near the entrance holding 2 cups of coffee. "You ready?" he asked with a smile. Ethan laughed nervously. "I think so." Walter handed him one of the cups. "You already survived the hardest part." Ethan looked at him quietly. And he knew he was right. The fire had destroyed his business. But it also destroyed the version of himself that lived only for money, pressure, and endless ambition. The old Ethan would have called this cafe too small. Now it felt perfect. A few minutes later, the doors opened for the first time. Customers slowly entered. Some were neighbors curious about the new place. Others were people Ethan once knew from his old restaurant. A few were regular customers from Walter's coffee cart. The cafe quickly filled with conversation and laughter. But unlike before, Ethan wasn't running around stressed and angry trying to control every detail. He moved calmly. He smiled. He actually talked to people. A little girl waved at him from one of the tables. "Your hot chocolate is really good," she said excitedly. Ethan grinned. "Thank you." Her mother laughed softly. You should have seen her face after the first sip. Moments like that used to mean nothing to him. Before the fire, Ethan only cared about profits, reviews, and expansion plans. Customers were numbers. Success was measured by money. Now he noticed the small moments instead. The smiles. The conversations. The feeling inside the cafe. And somehow, those things mattered more. Weeks passed, and the cafe slowly became popular throughout the neighborhood. Not because it was fancy, but because it felt warm. People came there when they felt lonely. Students studied quietly in corners. Elderly couples shared coffee near the windows every morning. And Ethan learned everyone's names just like Walter once did. One evening, after closing the cafe, Ethan sat outside watching the sunset color the sky orange and pink. Walter joined him carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Busy day," Walter said. Ethan smiled softly. The old me would have complained about how much bigger this place could be. Walter laughed. "And now?" Ethan looked through the cafe windows at people inside smiling and talking together. "Now I think this is enough." Walter nodded proudly. For years, Ethan believed happiness lived somewhere far away, hidden behind success, money, and achievement. But happiness had never been waiting at the top of success. It was hidden inside simple moments he had ignored his entire life. One rainy evening a few months later, the cafe door opened quietly near closing time. A young man in his 20s walked inside wearing a wrinkled suit. His face looked exhausted. His eyes carried the same emptiness Ethan once saw in his own reflection. The cafe was nearly empty now. Ethan walked over politely. "Long day." The young man forced a weak laugh. "You could say that." Ethan prepared him a coffee and placed it gently on the table. The young man stared at the cup silently before finally speaking. "I lost my job today." Ethan sat down across from him quietly. The young man rubbed his face with trembling hands. "I honestly feel like my whole life just ended." Those words hit Ethan deeply because he remembered saying almost the exact same thing after the fire. For a moment, he saw his old self sitting there. Broken. Lost. Convinced life was over. Ethan looked at him carefully before smiling gently. "No," he said softly. "Sometimes life falls apart so something better can begin." The young man looked confused. Ethan understood that look too. Because when people are drowning in pain, hope sounds impossible. But Ethan knew something now that he didn't understand a year earlier. The worst night of his life had also become the most important turning point he would ever experience. If the fire never happened, he would still be trapped inside a life filled with stress, loneliness, and endless pressure. He would still ignore the people who loved him. He would still believe money mattered more than peace. Losing everything forced him to rebuild himself completely. And strangely, that became the greatest gift life ever gave him. The young man slowly picked up his coffee. "You really believe things can get better?" Ethan smiled warmly. "I know they can." Outside, rain tapped softly against the cafe windows while warm light filled the room. And for the first time in many years, Ethan realized something beautiful. He no longer missed the life he lost in the fire. Because the life waiting for him afterward was far better than anything he could have imagined.